Thanks to the organizers, Satchel and Scott, and this is great. Welcome to another, 17th installment of the Kirsty and Kevin show. I think it's particularly appropriate that we're presenting at on a panel called Doing Surveillance Studies, because many years ago, Kirsty and I, along with Dr. Jennifer Whitson, who was then master's student Jennifer Whitson, we did a special issue of Surveillance in Society called Doing Surveillance Studies. So this is a theme we're well accustomed to dealing with. And part of that early discussion and part of the discussion that sort of continues is sort of where are the boundaries of surveillance studies? Where, how far does it extend? And we have these types of discussions often around definitional issues, what is and is not surveillance. But I want to start with two quick examples. And some of you are subscribed to the Surveillance in Society listserv, which is a great resource of sort of sometimes random but sometimes quite interesting bits of fact and information. And you might have come across, it's kind of bright in here, you may not see that. That is a giant, close to 6 foot across surveillance jellyfish, which has been created by University of Virginia with funding by DARPA. That essentially the aims of this are to, the great thing about jellyfish is that they use very little energy. So the idea is that you would release this into the ocean, it's filled with all kinds of sensors, and the plan is to use this for at this point, very unspecified, very unspecified ambitions around conservation, but also around military types of ambitions. So that's the first example. That's better. Thank you. And the second example, this just circulated, I think within the last couple of weeks. There's a story, or several stories circulating now about how a whole series of conservation and environmental agencies are using drones for a myriad of different purposes. So watching wildlife, trying to track poachers, they're using them to monitor the Japanese whaling fleet, to watch for drift net, illegal drift net kind of fishing. I particularly like the fact that they're being used for illegal hunting in the United States, trying to track poachers, which has led a series of hunting organizations to lobby Congress for strict controls of drones, and suggesting that they should only be used in criminal cases with strict warrant kind of provisions. So it's great how politics makes for wonderful bedfellows. But these are just two examples of what I want to talk about today. It's really the broad intersection between nature and surveillance, something that, with some very few exceptions, nice that David Murakami Wood introduced us today, because David was talking about these things quite some time ago, but it's not a topic that's really been taken up. And this is a paper that Dan Trottier, who is in the back there, and I were writing, and is forthcoming, so we can talk, both of us, if you want, we can talk about this. And what I want to really do is just, not so much make an argument, but really just map a whole series of intersections between surveillance and something that we might call nature. And I'll get to kind of the preliminary social constructionist kind of stuff out of the way. We're very attuned to the fact that nature is a historically contingent and cross-culturally variable type of construct. We're very attuned to that. But we're just really interested in what I want to try and do today is just map maybe 4 different types of categories of ways in which surveillance maps onto nature. And I'm going to conclude with a few comments about maybe why it is that despite the fact that when you start thinking about these things, they're everywhere, but we really haven't engaged with them in surveillance studies. So try to at least brainstorm a little bit, maybe we can think together about these types of things. So the first category that I want to use is, maybe you can't see that, but it's learning, dominating, and conserving. And the origins of this go back to perhaps the origins of the Enlightenment or the scientific revolution, where science emerged hand in hand with a whole series of visualizing devices, from the telescope and the microscope, and seeing the world, understanding the world was tied into a whole series of ways of visualizing the world. And this continues to this day, from new ways of seeing the planet, brain scanning technology. Science often advances hand in glove with new ways of visualizing the world. And you see this again, in relationship to nature, where you have global satellites circling the planet, watching for migrations of wildebeest and whales and all kinds of other animals. You have a situation in if you do studies and ask people, what is the most pristine, what is the most natural place on Earth? The answer systematically is the Brazilian rainforest. Again, the Brazilian rainforest, rather than being a pristine sort of untouched space, now has the Brazilian, do you remember the name of this?
It used to be called Sensipal.
Right. This is a major initiative between the Brazilian government and the U.S. government to use satellite sensors to essentially penetrate the canopy of the Brazilian rainforest to watch for poachers, to watch for deforestation, to watch for drug smuggling, etc. So even at this most iconic natural space on Earth, you have surveillance going on. And this connection with science, continues in one of my favorite developments is just the census of marine life. And this is a remarkable I think something like 30 states are involved in this. And this is an attempt to, and I quote, to identify every living organism in the oceans. It's impossible, and they know that, it's hubris. But it has led to really quite remarkable sort of scientific discoveries, the discovery of all kinds of animals, organisms that people did not know existed previously living at sort of the ocean's depths. And it's produced actually about 6 wonderful coffee table books. You can imagine these are wonderful images, and I think what's the telling, or at least interesting, is that the first coffee table book that was produced from this project was called Citizens of the Ocean, which I just think is really lovely from a surveillance perspective, because you have a census which leads to citizens, and it's kind of a nice kind of connection there. So the point is that visualizing is very much tied to science, and science, over at least the past century, has been very much part of or tied into an edutainment kind of function. And this was, documentary filmmaking has been a constant almost since the emergence of television and film. It's always been sort of a small market kind of share. And this quest to document nature has pushed filmmakers into ever more remote and ever more dangerous types of locations to get images of spectacular types of things. And nowadays, the increasing mobility, the increasing micro nature of recording devices allows them to embed cameras in remote controlled types of little cars that they use, drones, night vision equipment. You can get images of lions and tigers in the middle of the night. You also have a series of these things called laser traps. These are traps. These are essentially laser technologies that you put out in the woods if you're a scientist or a hunter, interestingly, and you can tell if an animal goes by and you can take pictures of it. And if you just go online to the Smithsonian Wild website, they have over 200,000 images just freely available of sort of startled and bemused looking animals. And again, hunters are increasingly using these as well. You also get, again, the ability to embed animals with microchips has become a major initiative. So you have all kinds of, I think the Ocean Tracking Network is now embedding salmon and all kinds of other animals with sensors that allows them to track their location, allows to track their breathing, even when they open and close their mouth to detect if they're eating and if they're yawning. I did not know that they yawned, but it will actually detect whether they're yawning. So what, in this first sort of category here, is what you see is that by degrees, nature is becoming nature under scrutiny, nature under observation, nature under documentation. Which sort of connects with the next category that we talked about, and that's animal agents. And this is connected because not only do we watch creatures, but creatures watch us and they watch one another. And that this recognition of this has prompted a whole series of ways to what we call instrumentalize the gaze, to transform the visualizing abilities of animals into something that's useful for human purposes. And I'll just give you some examples, but what's different here is that than the previous section is here, it's not so much they're trying to learn about the animals themselves, but trying to use the animals as devices for other types of projects. And this is one of the earliest examples. This is a pigeon camera used in the First World War. You would strap this cute little device to the pigeon, the homing pigeon, and they would fly over the troops, and you would get pictures of troop movements, or you get pictures of installations, and they would hopefully fly back. And I say hopefully fly back because just this year in London they found a dead one of these pigeons with this little harness strapped to it in somebody's chimney when they were cleaning it out. So they weren't necessarily faithful kinds of, but this is one of the earliest examples of these types of things. But these initiatives continue to try and instrumentalize animals. The U.S. government has long had a marine animal unit that straps cameras onto animals. These have been used. These probably reached their height during the Cold War, but there continues to be a unit. They are used actively in the Persian Gulf right now to watch for infiltrators and to sort of monitor for ship movements. They include dolphins. They have walruses. They have orcas. They're all part of this kind of initiative, and so this kind of stuff continues in Afghanistan right now. The SAS is using German shepherds that have cameras strapped to their heads to move into, to go look for insurgents in buildings, etc. Because a dog is not as obviously not as problematic if they get hurt. And again, back to the ocean tracking network. The idea here, in some ways, is to instrumentalize these animals to learn about ocean tides, the sensors that you might embed in animals. You can learn about ocean tides, salinity, the temperature of the ocean. So again, the animals become instrumentalized, literally become part of the experimental tool. And some of you, so the aim of this, and I quote from one of their promotional brochures, is to, quote, transform the world's marine life into bioprobes that will reveal the secrets of the sea. And it's not just fish, not just mammals, insects are a big part of this now. And again, DARPA is a large proponent of this type of stuff, where they are gluing on sensors to bugs that are then released, and the information can be conveyed back to their handlers. They have projects right now that actually work in the laboratory where they are at the pupa stage with some beetles. They are embedding sensors onto the beetles at pupa stage, and then their shell grows over them. So you actually have a living kind of sensing organism that moves back, that sends information back and forth. And this obviously gives new meaning to sort of fly on the wall or being bugged. It is not the most extreme examples that I could come up with, but I won't sort of deal with all of them. But what you see here in this sort of second category is a whole series of sort of cyborg assemblages of surveillance and monitoring, where the human, the animal, the technology are hard to distinguish and make clear demarcations about where things end and where things begin. And this is again all being directed for various human purposes. The third one that I want to talk about is called, we refer to as directing and capitalizing on natural abilities, and that's a hero rat. And in the back, you can see the man with the helmet on. That's his handler. I'll come back to the hero rat in a second. But before I get to that, when we were writing this piece, there was an article that was circulating quite widely at the time that, I think it was published in Nature or Science, major sort of journal, that discovered that European robins navigate. They can actually see the Earth's magnetic field, and we often wonder how is it that animals can navigate sort of huge distances, etc. The scientific community was completely abuzz about this because they thought that they had never anticipated that animals would have evolved these remarkable types of sensory abilities. But in one level it's kind of remarkable, at another level it's just yet another example of animals having sensory abilities that extend beyond the range of human beings that we often sort of envy or admire. And what we're talking about here, about how those are also sort of instrumentalized as a whole series of surveillance projects. And there are essentially two different categories here. One is to try and train an animal to sense in certain ways, and then we would actually be able to tell what they're seeing, or else the other is to learn as humans when they actually spontaneously do things, and that our role is to actually understand that. And the most famous example of the latter one is the canary in the coal mine kind of thing, when for methane detectors, miners would take canaries down into coal mines with them, and if the coal mine, if the canary died, it was a pretty good sign that there was a poisoning going on, and everyone would rush out. These are now referred to as biosentinels in the sort of scientific literature, and that you can learn a lot about what's going on in the environment by paying attention to the natural responses of animals. Scientists are paying attention to invertebrates that are around corporations, plants that sort of produce chemicals, because if they die and at what rate they die, you can tell what kind of poisoning is going on. The other one I mentioned is the training of the animals, and this brings us back to the hero rat. And this is a very familiar thing if you think about it, the way in which all kinds of animals have been incorporated into various types of wars on crime and drugs and terrorism. Dogs being a classic example. Amber Marks has written a wonderful book a few years ago that sort of gives a whole bestiary of different ways in which animals, bees in particular, are being used for monitoring purposes. And the hero rat that I showed a second ago has been trained to sniff for TNT. And its handler sort of stands off in the background, and that rat can sort of detect landmines, and then they dig them up. So rats have gotten they've gotten some good press recently. But in all of those examples, under this category, the existence, the physical existence of the animal is paramount. You have to see them either immediately, or you have to have some sort of mediated relationship with them. The last one I want to talk about is sort of different, and this is biomimicry. This is not biomedics, this is biomimicry. Biomimicry is just a fancy word for a very old practice, and that is that people, scientists, human beings, learning from nature. Classic example of biomimicry is sort of the ancient attempt to learn how to fly or learn about flight from looking at birds. And what biomimicry now is a very popular, it's sort of a posh development in science. It sort of says, nature has existed for millennia, it's learned all of these adaptive mechanisms. Let's learn from nature. Let's see how nature is adapted. Let's use so there's books, there's conferences, and it's got a sort of a green kind of edge to it, which is sort of problematic in some ways. And two of the more famous examples of this, anyone know what the top left image is? Velcro. It's a blown up image of Velcro. And Velcro is one of the classic examples of biomimetics, because essentially the person who invented Velcro, he had a dog, and his dog kept getting burrs on it, and he kept going, how does this work? How is it that these burrs stick to my dog? And he looked into it, and it's this classic kind of hoop and latch mechanism, and that's essentially what Velcro is. On the bottom, that's a kingfisher series of trains in Japan, that the extended nose of the trains have been modeled on the kingfisher because they cut through the air better, they reduce noise. Again, there's lots of other examples of biomimetics. But when you look into biomimetics, you find that a lot of the examples, a lot of the natural traits that they're trying to emulate involve sensing, surveillance, and particularly sensors. The remarkable range of sensors that animals or insects have, they're trying to emulate a lot of this kind of stuff. And I'll just give you some examples. On the left would be the animal. In the middle column is their natural ability, or on the right are some of the ways or some of the uses that they're trying to develop for using these types of abilities. So, The bottom one, Dragonfly, has a compound eye. They're trying to develop 3 surveillance devices modeled on this that have 360-degree capability. My favorite is on the next one, the black jewel beetle, the second last one. This is remarkable. It's a little tiny beetle in the United States that can detect a forest fire 50 miles away. It's unbelievable, and of course, we want to model it to develop heat-seeking missiles. That's what you do with these things. But the point here is that when you poke at what's going on with biomimetics, a lot of it is trying to model sensors that are going to be used for all kinds of different human purposes. Some of this is appealing and some of it's quite appalling. But it is this growing field. And some of this also models nature in very different ways. So the bottom image is an image of a dolphin, and they've discovered that we all know that dolphins have good sensory abilities, but they've recently discovered in the lower jaw they have quite remarkable sensory abilities for low water kind of detection. And this is again being used for military kinds of applications. The other one is actually a drone, and that is not fictional, that exists. That is a real drone, and if you can't see it, at the very tip there is a syringe. The idea here is that you would be able to sort of remotely inject people with whatever you wanted to inject them with. So this is not science fiction. But again, here you have and drones, you know, we've talked about this as the year of the drone, or last year was the year of the drone. We have not seen anything yet in terms of the extent to which they are about to become very, very small. And again, this is modeled very much on animal models. So I'm just going to, I'm conscious of the time, so I'm just going to make a few concluding comments. I think thinking about nature and surveillance at one level introduces a new domain to thinking about surveillance studies. It sort of challenges some of our definitions, but really what I just want to just hypothesize by way of concluding comments is that it's interesting that with some few exceptions, people in surveillance studies haven't been interested in this kind of stuff, although when you look around, it's everywhere. And I wonder to what extent this is about sort of our political commitments. That most people, I think, coming into surveillance studies come from a broadly humanist tradition, broadly civil libertarian type of tradition, interested in the consequences of surveillance for people, for human rights. And this is all right and this is all good. To the extent that some people are exclusively concerned with surveillance only for people, and in fact, some people will define surveillance only as something that's negative, like people are familiar with Christian Fuchs and sort of his colleagues saying surveillance is only a negative type of phenomenon. So I think that I'm hypothesizing that part of the neglect of surveillance in nature has because some of this stuff, a lot of this stuff, does not map neatly onto a civil libertarian humanist type of politics. There are politics here that I'll mention, but it's not, certainly the drones at the end, you can sort of see, you can become alarmed about them and you see a straightforward kind of humanist connection. But some of it doesn't actually map very well onto a civil libertarian thing. But I think there are clearly civil libertarian concerns here. Obviously, the surveillance of nature can be done as a way, it turns out to be a way of testing surveillance practices that end up being used to monitor people. The surveillance of nature, 1 minute? I will be done in 1 minute. Surveillance of nature is often a form of normalizing practices, that we become familiar with them. But I think even when you move stray from the civil libertarian type of tradition, there's obviously a politics here, but it's a politics of perhaps conservation, politics of nature, and how is it that surveillance is part of the politics of nature? Are we moving to a space where this is inevitable? That in a world of environmental collapse, that ambitions of monitoring the planet, monitoring its human relationships with the planet,
becomes a major surveillance ambition. And is one of the consequences is maybe that as we acquire yet more dominion over nature, that nature becomes less nature and more natural resource. I will end there. Thank you.